We call it
Expedition Truth.
and we know you're going to love it. You ready now?
Somewhere, among the many competing voices in the world, truth is just waiting to be discovered. So sit back, open your mind to a world beyond your imagination. A world where truth never fears questions. Welcome to Expedition Truth with your host, Jack Ashcraft.
Yeah, welcome to the program. Thanks for joining us. I'm glad you did. And I think we have an interesting discussion ahead of us. We've all made it through another week, and we've survived. And despite all of the crazy politics and idiocy going on around us, brought to us by our government, both state and local, we're all surviving. We're all here tonight. So let's talk about some other idiocy. We're going to talk tonight about atheism, which is, in my opinion, idiocy. We've all known or know or have run into atheists online or at work or in person. And if you even try to discuss anything of a spiritual nature, you'll know the resistance you meet with in an atheist. And the atheists like to make claims like religion is to blame for all the wars of the world, which is just not true historically. I mean, even somebody with the most simplistic grasp of world history knows that just isn't true. Even in those conflicts where faith has been used as a pretext, it was to really dig deep enough, you'll find that most of the time there was politics involved, and faith was just propaganda for the politicians, even at that time. But they'll ignore things like, atheistic regimes, political regimes throughout history, like the former Soviet Union, that murdered millions upon millions of people in the name of atheism, which they try to claim, no, it was in the name of communism. No, it was their communism was informed by their atheism, which is in turn informs their communism. And, they targeted specifically people of faith. There's no question about that, and slaughtered millions. And that has been the case with literally every atheistic regime in history. And atheism is not a healthy worldview. I talked to a gentleman just a few weeks ago who had been a lifelong atheist, and he was miserable. His worldview was dark. He felt like his life was empty. He found himself on antidepressant medication. And as he said to me, his atheism kept him from living fully, because it kept him from exploring those things that we refer to as spiritual. And I think that his story is much more common than I think even many atheists would like to believe, especially the internet atheists, who are usually just the most loud and obnoxious amongst their number. And so I wanted to have my guest come back tonight. Those of you who have been longtime listeners of the program will recognize him. He's a researcher and lecturer on issues pertaining to worldview philosophies and world religions. And he's authored a number of books, articles, and he's had his work published. He's been interviewed for many radio programs and podcasts. Our returning guest is Ken Ammi. Ken, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me back.
So Ken, atheism, you heard my opening comments there. why is it that somebody like the gentleman I spoke to, why is it, do you think, that atheism kept him from living a full life, as he put it? What was your insight on that?
Well, what we are dealing with from our worldview, looking at it from the atheism from the outside, is that would be a person who has lived a life of open, unrepentant rebellion against God. And by his atheistic worldview, he has thereby sought to deconstruct God's created order. So when you're rebelling against God and his created order, sure, it might afford you some worldly pleasures temporarily, but eventually it's all going to collapse down around you just by the very nature of your focus and actions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it leads inevitably to nihilism.
It begins, it is, and it ends in nihilism.
Yeah.
Except that I find that, of course, some atheists fall for one of atheism's consoling delusions, which is the delusion of subjective meaning and an objectively meaningless existence. So this is where you have atheists claiming, I don't need no God to tell me the meaning of my life. I make up my own life.
Mm-hmm.
And well, we have a history of humanity where many people have sought to do exactly that. And the results are generally as terrifying as those that you mentioned in your opening, which is, well, you just open the door for anybody to do anything they want. So you're not really going to like that when the chickens come home to roost and people are doing things you don't approve of, but it's because you told them, hey, find your own meaning. It's all subjective.
Mm-hmm. I think when you examine the lives of those people who offer that argument, when you look closely at them, you'll find that most of them are anything but good people, really. They're not even decent. They don't treat others well. They're certainly immoral, and I would suggest degenerate. And I think that's the rule.
But the thing is, you're using all these terms such as good, moral, and degenerate.
Right.
But those categories collapse on atheism. They just don't exist, because when you have a universe and all it contains, including human life, coming about by accident, then there are no universal imperatives to do anything.
Mm-hmm.
There are subjective personal preferences based on hidden assumptions, mind you, but there are no universal imperatives. So then, if we really did live within that world, then good, moral, all those concepts would be basically just adjudicated by some accidentally existing apes who came up with some rules to try to be able to get through the day without getting pummeled to death, or without lacking for resources, or whatever kind of altruistic theory you want to come up with. But that's all it is. So in other words, sure, human beings could come up with a lot of really fancy laws and rules and concepts to mitigate human behavior, but ultimately there would be no transcendent justice. There would be no absolutes. There would be no universal imperatives. There would just be subjective personal preferences based on hidden assumptions.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's also where atheistic faux morality is self-defeating, because most of those people who claim to be atheists are also very much in the leftist spectrum politically and socially, and they would suggest that things like racism, pedophilia, etc., are objectively evil or bad. Most of them, not all of the people will, but most of them. And I would agree that they're objectively evil, but the leftist can't really, or the atheist can't really say that any of those things are objectively evil. They can't even say that they're wrong in any sense, because, as you noted, their whole entire moral sense, if you want to give them that benefit, is totally subjective. And if it's subjective, then there are no moral absolutes. And so racism isn't objectively wrong. Pedophilia isn't objectively wrong. I mean, these kinds of things. And so I think it's self-defeating. I mean, would you agree with that, or do you think that there's something in their attempt at being moral that can stand up to scrutiny?
Well, one of the issues is that it requires quite a bit of digging to get to the bottom line issues. So that, for instance, and this is very, very low hanging fruit stuff, but if you say, well, atheists can't say anything's absolutely or objectively wrong, well, atheists can say whatever they want. Anybody can make any claim. The issue is whether it's actually a viable claim, whether it's cogent, whether it follows from the premise and leads to a conclusion. So that, for instance, I've had plenty of atheists tell me that morality is objective because, for example, it needs to revolve around suffering, it needs to revolve around human flourishing, it needs to revolve around being beneficent to others. And the issue is that the instant reaction is to agree with that because it makes perfect sense and it sounds oh so good. But the problem is that those are merely jumps to conclusions. They're just assertions. Why is it a universal imperative on atheism to minimize harm, for instance? Well, what will come from that is an answer that's just purely pragmatic and subjective, such as that, well, do you want people to try to harm you every day? Well, no, I don't. But that doesn't mean that there's some universal imperative against it, especially when, now this is going kind of a bit deeper, especially when what we would see as harm when we define it on that worldview would be an accidentally existing ape's accidental ability to interpret random biochemical neural reactions within a haphazardly evolved brain, right? I mean, you want to get reductionist, let's get reductionist and physicalist. That's what it is. So now, how is it wrong to cause an accidentally existing ape to interpret accidental biochemicals to the conclusion that, hey, I'm not enjoying this? I mean, and that's the problem you have with issues like slavery, for instance. What's wrong with one group of accidentally existing apes causing other accidentally existing apes to work for room and board and not for wages, or to be mistreated within a universe where there's no universal imperative to avoid mistreating when it comes down to it?
Yeah, I mean, if the driving force of nature is only survival of the fittest and man is only a product of nature itself, then things like self-sacrifice and compassion, those mean nothing. They're meaningless, and they're not objective.
See, even then, the issue is that any worldview comes with baggage, and we might actually need to discuss whether atheism is a worldview, because I get a lot of arguments about that. But it'll come with certain baggage, and there's certain things that just come with. So, for instance, you mentioned the surviving as the fittest. Well, the very concept of the desire or instinct to survive itself would, on atheism, be accidental. It wasn't planned, it wasn't designed, it wasn't created. It's just something that accidentally happened along the way. And by golly, aren't we lucky that it happened to the first living organism, or else we wouldn't be here to discuss it, right? So even something as basic as the instinct to continue surviving is accidental on atheism. And there's no universal imperative to adhere to it either. It's just a personal subjective preference that, hey, I want to keep existing. That's just my choice du jour today, right?
Yeah. I find that so much of the attempts at apologetics by atheists are they just contradict their own worldview. And when you point that out, it's almost as if they're incapable of recognizing logic and the flaws in their attempts to be logical when it comes to things like, objective morals and values. Is there something built into the atheistic mindset that prohibits them from seeing their own errors? I mean, it really feels like it.
Well, there's a few things going on here. One is that the way that atheists have become accustomed to dealing with these issues is that they just show up on the scene, they say jump, and the theist, let's just talk about Christians now, the Christian says, well, how high, right? So then the atheist is in the driver's seat, whereas, and I've actually explained this to atheists, you're saying jump, you expect me or demand that I only answer you with how high, but instead I answer with why, and that's it, you're done, you fall apart, because on your worldview, there is no reason for me to justify anything or prove anything or show evidence of anything. So that one of the first things I'll ask an atheist when they demand, say, for example, they say, well, show me evidence that God exists. I don't start attempting to show them any evidence of anything. I just say, well, first of all, you need to justify your demand for evidence. You can't just show up and tell me to jump, and then I'm going to say how high. No, I'm going to ask you why. So on your worldview, what is the premise that you have for demanding evidence? And now the issue is if they say something like, well, but it's incumbent upon the claimant to bear the burden of proof. Well, guess what? That's just a fancy sounding statement that some accidentally existing apes came up with from atop their imitation ivory tower. Why should I be impressed that some accidentally existing apes who are philosophers or logicians came up with that? That is just another assertion on your worldview. So that what happens is that on atheism, even logic itself is accidental, right? Because logic wasn't created, it wasn't designed, it wasn't meant to be, it wasn't the end result of a goal. And our ability to discern logic is also accidental. And there's no universal imperative to be logical, nor to demand that other people should be logical. So the problem is so fundamental that there's not even a universal imperative or a premise for atheists to be logical in the first place, nor demand that anyone else be logical. But you can't live that way, right? And so that's why their entire endeavor, like a universal acid, it corrupts everything it touches. And that's why if you dig down into these fundamental level issues with atheists, you'll find that they're sitting atop an abyss, a bottomless pit of assertions. It'll just be nothing but one assertion after the other, after the other, after the other. When you take them seriously and you hold them to the fact that they are claiming that the universe and everything within it, including themselves and their thoughts, are the results of an accident, that's a result of an accident, that's a result of an accident, with no universal imperatives to do anything. I mean, the entire thing just collapses before it even begins.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting is that they inevitably find themselves, when they are arguing against theists, they inevitably find themselves attempting to engage in philosophy. And they do so very poorly. And their big hero that wrote, what is it, The God Delusion? What's his name?
Yes, Richard Dawkins.
Dawkins, right. He is the prime example of someone attempting to do philosophy and failing miserably at it. His books are so riddled with logical errors and unfounded, unsubstantiated assertions that I'm amazed that people even take the man seriously, but they do. and I for the life of me, I can't get it. I mean,
Well, misery loves company.
yeah, that's true. That's
Well,
true.
the issue is, so for example, I totally agree. In fact, I wrote a book titled Pop Atheist Bible Expositors. And as far as I know, it's the only book that focuses on how badly some of the most well-known atheists handle the text of the Bible. I mean, it's just pretty stunning. But now I was just listening to statements by Richard Dawkins just the other day, and he was lamenting how many Americans don't believe in evolution and how this is some sort of a tragedy, and he's likening people who deny evolution. This is atheistic evolution, of course. Likening them to Holocaust deniers. And I'm listening and I'm listening and I'm listening and I'm trying to find where he's telling us why it is incumbent upon us to believe in atheistic evolution, even if it could be proven 100%. What is the universal imperative for me to believe it just because it's true? You know what I mean? And it requires some digging to get to the level where you're able to ask those kind of questions. Like, even if it's true, especially if it's true, then there's no imperative for me to believe in it. Because if it is true that I'm an accidentally existing ape, why shouldn't I just deny it? Why am I required to believe in something within a universe wherein I exist by accident and there's nothing demanding that I adhere to reality? That's how fundamental this thing goes.
You know, I honestly never thought about it that way before. I mean, it can really lead you into living a fantasy life.
And if it does, it doesn't matter because,
right.
Okay, so there's the concept of the Darwinian survival mechanism, right? We don't know why, it's just an accident, but we want to survive. We have that instinct to survive. So now, what does it matter if I survive by adhering to empirical truth or by being completely deluded? What does it matter? As long as I survive and I propagate my DNA, it doesn't matter if I believe in true things or not. And so the more that somebody like Dawkins would demand that atheistic evolution is true, the more reason they're giving me to deny that it's true, because it wouldn't matter.
True, yeah. It's ultimately meaningless to your life if you're just an accident. And like you said, there is no transcendent reason why you should live according to truth, reality, etc. It's all just ultimately a meaningless farce. Yeah. So
exactly because on atheism, truth itself would be accidental because truth reflects reality. And well, guess what? Reality is accidental. Guess what? Well, because the universe is accidental. And then so facts are accidental, logic is accidental, and there's no universal imperative to adhere to any of it, to accept any of it. And again, yeah, you get the pragmatic arguments about how, well, but you could live a better mode. It looks like we're going into the break.
Yep, we got to go. We'll be right back.
Listening to Expedition Truth with Jack Ashcraft.
It's just good, clean fun.
Intelligent talk for the discerning mind. Share your thoughts of the show by calling 702-425-9230. That's 702-425-9230. Find us worldwide on Skype at KCOR Radio or jump into our live chat room at www.kcorradio.com.
Now the world will begin hearing us.
Truth than humanly possible after these brief words from our sponsors.
Every year around the world, thousands of golden retrievers are abused, abandoned, and neglected, and they need your help. Goldens Without Borders is a 501c3 not-for-profit company located in the heart of southern Nevada. They focus on golden retrievers in countries where neglect and mistreatment is of the worst imaginable. Even the smallest donations go a long way to saving a life and helping put these beautiful dogs into loving, forever homes. Come be a part of a network of people working hard to make the world a safer and more humane place for all living creatures. To make a donation, or if you're interested in adopting or fostering, please visit goldenswithoutborders.org. Goldens Without Borders, help make a difference today.
New from the best-selling author of Summerland, Leo Bonomo, The Voice of Spirit. A collection of transcripts as well as a forensically tested recording from direct voice medium Leslie Flint. Come listen to the dead speak from the afterlife through Leslie Flint. Pre-order The Voice of Spirit and get a signed and numbered copy, making it a treasured collector's piece as well as a 15% discount. The knowledge and connection to spirit that comes with this will be truly life-changing. The Voice of Spirit, Leslie Flint recordings, and transcripts by Leo Bonomo will be the most sensational book and set of recordings you'll ever own. To read stunning reviews of this book from some of the top spiritualists from around the world, as well as to order, go to www.leo-bonomo.com. That's leo-bonomo.com. Pick up your copy today.
You love them enough to do anything for them.
Mom, I need to be wiped.
Coming!
Including checking nhtsa.gov/the right seat to make sure they're in the right car seat. Brought to you by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration and the Ad Council.
We interrupt this program to annoy you and make things generally irritating.
At the end of the day, we turn the lights down in the KCOR studio.
Oh, sweet.
And crank up the hottest club songs from around the world.
This is the future.
The Grind, mixed by Tina Marie, your Vegas vixen of the high desert.
What about the body? What kind of body?
Good body. Nice body.
Every night from 11 p.m. to 2 a.m. Pacific. The best 3 hours of commercial-free music.
New music first.
It's time to stand up and dance your ass off. The Grind, nightly and exclusively on the KCOR Digital Radio Network.
Come on, it's kind of hot.
Welcome back to Expedition Truth. Expedition Truth.
This place is incredible.
Intelligent talk for the discerning mind. To be on the show live, call 702-425-9230. That's 702-425-9230.
What are you waiting for?
Worldwide callers, use Skype name KCOR Radio. Share your thoughts of the show on Twitter at KCOR Radio using hashtag KCOR. Even better, join like-minded individuals in our live chat room at KCORradio.com. Now, back to Expedition Truth with Jack Ashcraft, where the truth never fears questions.
Welcome back. If you just joined us, we are talking with Ken Ammi, and we're discussing atheism, the pitfalls, the errors, etc. And before we get back into the program, I want to remind our listeners that this program is listener-supported, and we survive on your generosity. If you like these programs, you want to hear this kind of content continue, then please consider becoming a supporter of the program. You can give a one-time gift at the KCRradio.com website. At the bottom of the main page, there is a link there where you can give a donation. You'll just mark your donation for Expedition Truth, and they'll take care of it from there. If you'd like to become a monthly patron, you can do so by visiting expeditiontruth.net, and there you will find a link to our Patreon page, and you can start at $1 a month or however much you want to give and become a regular monthly patron of the program. Patrons there will receive a free copy, PDF copy of my book, The Messianic Secret, which explores the lost years of Jesus and deals with some of the myths that are out there about it, explains where they come from and why they're wrong, and then goes into what Jesus' life would have been like as a typical Jewish boy growing up at that time. Patrons also have access to a periodic newsletter that I post there on our Patreon website that tells a little bit about upcoming guests, some more about, sometimes I post links regarding some of the programs that we have, some of our guests, things like that are connected. So we try to give a little back. And in the future, we have some other things planned, like hopefully some live streams that'll be exclusive to patrons. So if you feel led to give in that way, then you can do that again at expeditiontruth.net. You'll find a link there to our Patreon. And we also welcome your prayers. We'll take those as well. They certainly help us to keep things going on the program. So let's get back to it here. Ken, let's define our terms here. How would we accurately define atheism and address whether or not it really is a worldview? You mentioned that earlier in the program. So can you address those?
Sure. So like with any word in any language, there'll be a difference between meaning or definition and usage. And also meanings and usages can change throughout time. So for example, 2 millennia ago, Christians were referred to as atheists because they denied the Greek gods and later the Roman gods. But did being an atheist mean that they didn't believe in any god? Well, of course not, because they were monotheists. They were Trinitarian monotheists. But now, would it make sense today for me to call myself a Christian atheist? Well, no, because the meaning and the usage have changed. And so when we go back to the 1800s, late 1800s, Thomas Henry Huxley coined the term agnostic, because at the time it was known and understood that atheists were the ones who positively affirmed God's non-existence. Now that means that they were claiming to know that God doesn't exist. On the other hand, the theists were they were positively affirming God's existence, claiming to know God existed. But Huxley said, well, I don't have enough information to go in either extreme, so I'm going to just come up with a term that is a middle position, agnostic, just saying I don't have enough knowledge to go in either one of those directions. And so that was the point of that phrase, is that it was understood that atheism was a word that told us something about God's existence or lack thereof, whereas the preferred definition du jour, especially ever since the new atheist movement, is just that atheism means that an individual is identifying themselves as lacking a belief in God. So the word has then gone from supposedly telling us something about God's existence to now telling us something about the subjective opinion of individuals. And that definition of atheism, that watered down one, there's essentially no difference between that and agnosticism. And it's also a term that came about, or really became popular and accepted, because of that very historical linguistic fact. Atheists were claiming to know that God didn't exist, so they were asked for proof, and they couldn't do it. So then they preferred this watered down position of just saying that they lack a belief in God. And now when you lack a belief in God, when you are an atheist of whatever denomination, then that comes with baggage, which is, for instance, why I started talking about atheistic evolution, because there's really no other game in town. So you're going to have an atheistic cosmogony, you're going to have an atheistic biology, you're going to have an atheistic morality. And so this is why I would refer to atheism as a worldview, because, well, quite often I'm challenged on that, and I just ask a simple question. In what area of your thinking, you as an atheist, do you accept that God actually and really exists? And I mean in anything and everything that you think about, any area whatsoever. And well, the answer inevitably is none, because I'm an atheist. I said, so then if no matter what you're thinking about, you always have the view in mind that God doesn't exist, well, then that's a worldview, because that is the core belief that you take into anything and everything that you ever think about. That's literally the definition of a worldview. And so again, that comes with certain baggage, and that includes the issues we've been discussing, such as the universe, such as human life, and such as morality and logic and everything else. It's viewed through that lens. And as you mentioned in the intro, it's also an issue of that atheism is thought restricting, because you're not allowed to go beyond certain parameters if you're an atheist, right? You're going to be a naturalist or a materialist or a physicalist or a reductionist, or whatever you want to term it. Everything will eventually just break down into these basic level components. And it's like you said about that person, that they were not allowed to look beyond that into anything spiritual while being consistent as an atheist. Now, ironically, let me just throw this in. Being consistent is not a universal imperative on atheism. Mm-hmm. So that's why atheists can only ever be consistently inconsistent.
Mm-hmm. Now, atheism inevitably expresses itself in what is being called scientism, which is itself, I think, a pseudo-religious worldview. What are your observations on scientism and the connection to atheism?
Right. So scientism is quite different from science itself or from the scientific method. Scientism would be the merely jumped to asserted conclusion that we should only accept views or hold to views of things about which the science can tell us, so that it becomes a sort of feedback or a vicious circle where a person who is very physicalist or reductionist or materialist as an atheist will get into the sciences and then come out of it saying, well, anything that isn't proven by science is just not something we should believe, right? And it's kind of been known. There's been studies done showing that there are people who get into the sciences because they have that worldview. And so they're kind of just justifying their worldview. And I'm granting, of course, that there's various forms of science. I mean, for instance, being an engineer is quite a bit different than being an evolutionist, right? One is very mathematical and very black and white, and you're going to build something, it's going to work or not, where the other one would be like a worldview philosophical interpretation of biology. So it's very subjective.
Yes, I agree. Sorry, I thought you were saying something else connected to that. I think that one of the common things you see if you're a theist with regard to atheists is they want to point to various sciences and various known supposedly facts of science. And of course, one of those is evolution. And I've tried to point out that evolution, as it pertains to humanity, remains a theory. It is not an established fact. There are no known transitional forms, none. All of the artwork that we see showing transitional forms are based on assumptions. And they're assumptions that have no foundation in actual science. In other words, they are not proven. There are no fossils of these transitionals. They simply don't exist. They're assumptions that are developed on atheistic presuppositions that, well, since man must have evolved, then his ancestors must have looked something like this. But these must-haves aren't necessarily so, are they?
No, and in fact, the problem with atheistic evolution is that it becomes a worldview philosophical hermeneutic and interpretive lens through which to then interpret biology or misinterpret it. 'Cause let's keep in mind, biology is a science, but atheistic evolution is a worldview philosophy. So then when when it's referred to as a theory, that is actually the problem, is that it then becomes an interpretive lens through which to interpret biology. And yet, on a logical level, as I noted before, it's completely self-defeating. Because if it could be proven to me 100% that I'm an accidentally existing ape, then what would follow from that is that there's no universal imperative for me to actually accept that, even if it could be proven 100%. There's nothing that would hold me to, well, therefore, now I actually have to believe that. In fact, it might be beneficial for me to deny it, just as a Darwinian survival mechanism. Hey, it helps me to survive to not believe that that's true. So then what's wrong with that? And the answer would have to be nothing. But this also touches upon an issue which leads me to refer to atheism as being pagan or neo-pagan. And I'll tell you why. So if we think about their claims or assertions about how life came to be, well, they have to appeal to nature as being their creator. And let me just read a couple sentences from Romans chapter 1. What can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made. So they are without excuse. Now get this. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. I mean, you could almost just get atheistic evolution and scientism out of just that one statement, is that in denying God, then they look to nature for their source of existence and for any kind of subjective meaning. That's why they're so adamant about evolution. I've asked plenty of atheists, do you troll the internet arguing with anybody else about any other scientific theory? Or is it because when you hear somebody question anything about atheistic evolution, you take it to be that they're actually touching upon the core of your worldview? I mean, they're touching upon the thing that brought you into existence and gives your life meaning, so that not only do you protect that, but you demand, like I said about Dawkins, that other people believe it as well.
Yeah, it's every bit as militant as any Muslim would be in defending and spreading their faith. And I cited some examples at the top of the hour here where atheists, when they've had absolute political power in various countries, have done just that, just like their Muslim counterparts. They forced others to accept their worldview, and if they didn't, well, they just killed them. So in that sense, I think Islam and atheism are not that far apart in their approach.
You know, it's really fascinating that you say that, because I'll just give you a very accessible resource for that. So there's an Encyclopedia of Wars published in 2005. That was the result of 9 history professors conducting research for a decade, where they chronicled what they reckoned to be 10,000 years of war. And the wars that they categorize as being religious wars make up less than 7%. And over half of those involve Islam. Now, in the meantime, atheists set the mass and serial murdering world's record in just merely a couple of decades, even though they were competing against religions that have been around for millennia. Mm-hmm. But now, something was brought up to me by an atheist not long ago who said, well, regardless of those facts, that doesn't actually tell us anything that's true or false about atheism or about those religions. And yeah, technically that's true. The fact that atheism has been more responsible for more deaths than any other worldview doesn't necessarily tell us whether it's true or false. But one of the issues is that on atheism, when they wipe out millions and millions and millions of people, there's nothing objectively wrong with that. There's nothing absolutely wrong with that. They're not violating anything whatsoever, and they're making evil, pain, and suffering even worse by guaranteeing that there's no transcendent justice, and by guaranteeing that ultimately it's for nothing. The evildoers got to enjoy their evil doing, and nothing. Then when they died, they just were annihilated, and that's the end of the story. Mm-hmm. And in fact, say, for instance, what we're dealing with right now, all the deaths due to COVID, well, isn't that just getting rid of the less fit? I mean, isn't that really beneficial to human evolution, that we're keeping the strong? I mean, wouldn't that be consistent? Isn't that the whole entire point of atheistic evolution? So then, in a way, we can't really say that evil, pain, and suffering are for nothing. They're actually good things on that worldview, because they alleviate us of the less fit and they benefit human evolution. I mean, this is how twisted that worldview becomes, where you have to end up calling good evil and evil good.
Mm-hmm. So how do you, in a sense, I guess, how do you reach an atheist in such a way that you can open their thinking up to something that is outside that worldview? I mean, it seems almost an impossible task.
Well, one thing is that we have the Holy Spirit on our side. Now, another issue is that is a little more difficult to do online, and I've done tons and tons and tons of it online. But the problem is, if the person just stops responding, then that's it. They go away.
Yeah, I usually don't even engage them online, because usually they're just there to call you names, etc. So I usually don't mess with them.
Yeah, that's true. That happens a lot. But what I'm saying is that maybe a personal friendship would be better, because it's less likely the person would just stop showing up. But one thing is, okay, it's easy to point out all the follies of atheism and atheists, because frankly, they've become caricatures of themselves, especially because of the new atheist movement. But the thing is, there's a lot to be appreciated. So for instance, when they complain about evil, pain, and suffering, I think that's a very, very important thing for us to think about, is that somewhere deep down in their soul, even if they deny they have a soul, they long for heaven. I mean, they long for redemption. They long for that things be made right. And they complain when things are wrong. And that's something that really needs to be appreciated and emphasized, particularly because it's not in keeping with their worldview, so that we can tell that they're looking beyond that, even if unconsciously they're seeking something and they don't even know where to find it, but they can look at this world and say something is very, very wrong here, and I'm really upset by it. And so if God exists, then I'm upset with God about it. Now, granting they have no coherent way to actually condemn God for anything, for various reasons, but I think that's something that we need to emphasize when we speak to them, is to come alongside and say, I empathize with you. I understand and I appreciate that you're very upset about some of the really upsetting things that are going on in this world. But you're not doing that based on your worldview. So let me share with you a worldview that makes sense of the extremes that humanity goes through, the loving, wonderful, beneficial actions that we take, as well as the horrendously terrible ones. What worldview makes sense of that? And a worldview whereby we're created in God's image and so are endowed with some of his attributes, and yet underwent the fall. That's what explains that. And then ultimately, we're looking forward to redemption. We're looking forward to restoration. And we're looking forward to God making all things right. And so that's not just wishful thinking, but it's based on the fact that we all long for that somehow and somewhere deep inside of us. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of the point I would make, is to break it down, their worldview, and show them how it's absolutely collapsed to begin with, but that because they're longing for something else, then guess what? That something else is here. It is here.
Kent, you want to tell our listeners how to connect with you and perhaps get your books?
Sure. It's very easy. Just go to truefreethinker.com, all one word. And I just make it really user-friendly. And I published 3 books about atheism, so I'll be glad to give any of your audience members a discount if they contact me about those.
Great. And if you're listening on YouTube, you'll find a link to Ken's website in the description to this video. I would ask you, if you enjoy this program, to give it a thumbs up, give it a like, share it so that more people can hear it, and consider subscribing. And Ken, thanks for being on the program. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, and God bless you all.
You too. From us here, that's the end of tonight's expedition. God bless everyone. Good night.
You've been listening to Expedition Truth, hosted by Jack Ashcraft. It's time to believe in the unbelievable. Live every Thursday night, 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on the KCOR Digital Radio Network. For more information on Jack Ashcraft, the show, as well as his guests, please visit his website at www.paleoorthodoxy.com. Expedition Truth. Intelligent talk for the discerning mind. Why? Because the truth never fears questions.
This is KCOR Las Vegas, home of the Digital Radio Network, broadcasting from a shack just south of Area 51. Wait, that doesn't exist. This is